Welcome to Sola Church Online.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Alan Rigg. This is my wife, Miranda Landers. Together, we are planting a life-giving church in Santa Monica, California this fall, 2021. While waiting for LA County to reopen, we launched online, so you're here. This is it.
Yay!
Sola Church Online. If you're watching on the Church Online platform and you're thinking of someone that you wish would watch with you today, there's actually a link in the chat feed. You can click invite and send them an invitation.
And if you're watching on Facebook, you can share this to your timeline.
If you watch on YouTube, be sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any new content from Sola Church.
And Alan, when this service premieres, we will be watching it from Santa Monica, California.
That's right. Yay!
Yay!
Yeah, we will have actually moved into our new apartment. So, again, for those who might not fully know, we rode out the pandemic in our motorhome at the Miranda Hot Springs Christian Conference Center in Miranda, California, where I have been teaching at Calvary Chapel Bible College. So we're so grateful to, our sending church, Calvary Chapel Costa Mesa, where we attended prior to launching Sola Church, for providing this interim housing. That was such a huge and strategic investment in us and in this church plant. So grateful to Brian Broderson and our whole CCCM fam. But we are now in our new apartment. Again, when this airs, we will actually be in our new apartment. And that's a game changer for us to have boots on the ground, for us to be physically present in Santa Monica.
Such a game changer. And we cannot wait to meet all of you in person in Santa Monica.
That's right.
And I can't think of a better way to celebrate than through worship.
Yeah.
So let's worship together.
And even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, your perfect love is casting out fear. And even when I'm caught in the middle of the storms of this life, I won't turn back. I know you are near, and I will fear no evil, for my God is with me. And if my God is with me, whom then shall I fear? Whom then shall I fear? Oh no, you never let go, through the calm and through the storm. Oh no, you never let go, from every high and every low. Oh no, you never let go, Lord, you never let go of me. And I can see a light that is coming for the heart that holds on. A glorious light beyond all compare. And there will be an end to these troubles, but until that day comes, we live to know you here on the earth. And I will fear no evil, for my God is with me. And if my God is with me, whom then shall I fear? Whom then shall I fear? Oh flashes of lightning, rolls of thunder. Blessing and power, strength and glory and power be to you, the only wise King. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. With all creation I sing praise to the King of Kings. You are my everything, and I will adore you. Filled with wonder, awestruck wonder at the mention of your name. Jesus, your name is power, breath and living water, such a marvelous mystery. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. With all creation I sing praise to the King of Kings. You are my everything, and I will adore you. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. With all creation I sing praise to the King of Kings. You are my everything, and I will adore you. I will With all creation I sing praise to the King of Kings. You are my everything, and I will adore you.
So this is that time in our service when we worship with our giving. If you are our guest today, if you're checking Sola Church out, please don't feel obligated to give. For those of us that have made Sola Church our church home, this is a really special part of the service. So you'll see a link in the chat feed. It'll open a separate window. You won't miss anything. And of course, you can always go to our website, solachurch.life, and click give. There you can make a one-time tax-deductible donation or even schedule a recurring donation. If you prefer to give using PayPal, the email address that you're going to need for that is give@solachurch.life. Because of your generosity, we're able to do church online each week. But more importantly, we're actually building our launch fund. We've got lots of investments to make in the weeks and months ahead before our in-person launch, hopefully in September.
Right.
And so every gift, large and small, gets us a step closer to that goal. Thank you guys so much for your generosity.
Absolutely. And we are just a couple weeks out from our very first in-person startup party.
Yeah, it's going to be so amazing. Now, again, the date is to be announced. Because we're in the middle of this move when we're taping this, we're having to bank a bunch of services in advance. And so I wish I had that date today to drop it into this announcement segment for you. It's possible that by the time this actually airs, we may be able to drop some text over the screen with more specific information, or even create another video element that we can simply drop into this service. So who knows what could happen next as you watch. But it will be soon after June 15th. We're going to try to make it around that weekend that comes right after June 15th. That, of course, is when California reopens. So part of the challenge is that venues right now, they're either having a hard time with that date, or they still have questions about what the new guidelines are going to look like exactly. So if you guys would pray with us that in the next few days we could actually nail this thing down once and for all. But as we tell you each week, watch the website, watch our social media. This hour-long event is going to be so fun. We're going to have lots of time to meet and mingle, but at the end of that hour, you and I will do a presentation. We'll cast vision for Sola Church, and everybody will have the opportunity to fill out a response card indicating their interest level going forward.
Right. And Alan, this is for anyone who lives in West LA or is within driving distance and wants to be a part of launching this life-giving church, Sola Church in Santa Monica, right?
Yeah, 100%. Of course, we're going to be there, obviously, but so too will members of our launch team, and also people who've attended one of our virtual startup parties that now want to follow up, take that next step and attend an in-person startup party. We want you there with your family and with your friends.
So to register for one of these startup parties, you go to solachurch.life, click Attend a Startup Party. And with that, let's get into our time of teaching.
So we've been talking about how before we are heroic, we are not unheroic, but pre-heroic. And so it's an amazing thing as we move from pre-heroic to heroic. But then there's another thing that we need to talk about, and that is the possibility that we might at some point be post-heroic. Let's turn in our Bibles to Judges chapter 7. We're in this message series called Heroes. We're looking at the highlights found in the Old Testament book called Judges. And in this series, we've been inspired by the stories of both women and men called judges who did heroic things with their lives. And so we've talked about how it's not just about their story, it's about yours. Heroes is the series that asks the question, what's your story? What does it look like for you to live heroically in this moment? So we're going to gather some more lessons today as we pick it up in Judges 7, verse 24. It says, "Then Gideon sent messengers throughout all the mountains of Ephraim, saying, 'Come down against the Midianites and seize from them the watering places as far as Beth-bara and the Jordan.' Then all the men of Ephraim gathered together and seized the watering places as far as Beth-bara and the Jordan. And they captured 2 princes of the Midianites, Oreb and Zeeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and Zeeb they killed at the winepress of Zeeb. They pursued Midian and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeeb to Gideon on the other side of the Jordan." So we've learned how in this book called Judges, there is this recurring cycle where the people sinned and suffered, and then they cried out and they were delivered. This is part of the 4th cycle that actually began in Judges 6, verse 1. So this is the 3rd week that we've been looking at this hero named Gideon. Gideon was about to lead the children of Israel against a coalition of sand people, to use a Star Wars reference. And though outnumbered 135,000 to 32,000, God said in chapter 7, verse 2, that Gideon had too many men. So first he sent home 22,000 who were scared, and then he sent home 9,700 who didn't drink right, and he was left with only 300 soldiers. And it was then that Gideon said, "Spartans, prepare for glory." Actually, that's the wrong 300. Have you seen that movie, 300? It's true that Leonidas would lead 300 against the Persians at Thermopylae. Later, Alexander the Great would lead 300 against 30,000 in India. And later still, there was a Byzantine emperor who would lead 300 against Antioch. But this is the original 300. And it is said that it's still studied by and cited by military scholars today. Gideon divided his men into 3 companies, made his move after dark. It was a surprise attack. They blew trumpets, they broke pitchers, they burned torches. They created so much confusion among the sand people that they began killing each other. Like many deaths were the result of friendly fire. So the surviving sand people went the only direction they could. They went toward the largest river in Israel, the Jordan. And so Gideon asked Ephraim, which, the Ephraim tribe, that until now had been a non-combatant, if they would cut off the water crossings. And so as we'll see later in the study, 15,000 crossed, but not before Ephraim captured and killed these 2 princes in verse 25. Oreb actually means raven, and Zeeb actually means wolf. They sound like code names, don't they? Have you ever thought about what your code name would be if you had one? There's actually a website you can check out called codenamegenerator.com. When you go, there are 3 operators that you can choose between, and then it will generate a code name for you. I just went with the default setting, which gives you a code name made up of a color, a metal, and a dog. So you want to know my code name? My code name came up Green Lead Chow Chow. I don't know what that means, but at any rate, these guys were like real headhunters in verse 25. They took the heads of these princes. How did they transport them? In an ice chest? And what did Gideon do with them? Did he use them as bookends? I don't know. But in chapter 8 it says, "Now the men of Ephraim said to him, 'Why have you done this to us by not calling us when you went to fight with the Midianites?' And they reprimanded him sharply. So he said to them, 'What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? God has delivered into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeeb, and what was I able to do in comparison with you?' Then their anger toward him subsided when he said that." So Gideon was from the Manasseh tribe. Ephraim and Manasseh had been brothers. Manasseh was the firstborn, but their grandfather Jacob blessed Ephraim instead. And so what started as a sibling rivalry had eventually evolved into a tribal rivalry. But how self-absorbed is it in verse 1 when the men of Ephraim say, "Why have you done this to us?" Well, actually, Gideon had done it for everyone. This great victory benefited Ephraim just like it did all the other tribes. But these men could only see their part in this. They could only see how they felt slighted in this. And it's a sad thing. It's a sad thing when we do this, when we are so self-absorbed, whether it's at home, whether it's at work, whether it's at church, that we can't see how something, benefits everyone, including us, but can only see some perceived slight in it for us. It reminds me of like when an athlete can't be happy that their team won the championship because, they're upset that they didn't get enough playing time or didn't get enough touches, so to speak, in the game. Well, I love Gideon's way of handling this. He handles this much better than he handles what follows. In this particular case, he models for us what we read in Proverbs 15, verse 1, which is, "A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." He gave a soft answer. So, it's been said that when we come upon a fire, Gideon was presented with a fire. We've all got a bucket. The question is, are we going to throw water on the fire or are we going to throw fuel on the fire? And Gideon, at least in this case, chose to throw water on the fire. We definitely want to be the people that do that. So picking it up in verse 4, it says, "When Gideon came to the Jordan, he and the 300 men who were with him crossed over, exhausted, but still in pursuit. Then he said to the men of Succoth, 'Please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted. And I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, kings of Midian.' And the leaders of Succoth said, 'Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hand, that we should give bread to your army?' So Gideon said, 'For this cause, when the Lord has delivered Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, then I will tear your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars.'" So in spite of the social obligation to provide hospitality, their fear of retaliation, should Gideon lose, was so great that they refused to help him. In Gideon's eyes, this made them collaborators. So he's like, fear this. Look at verse 8. It says, then he went up from there to Penuel and spoke to them in the same way. And the men of Penuel answered him as the men of Succoth had answered. So he also spoke to the men of Penuel, saying, when I come back in peace, I will tear down this tower. Now, these guys were east of the Jordan. So Succoth, Penuel, both on the east side of the Jordan River. It might be helpful to remember that when the children of Israel, following the Exodus, following the wilderness wanderings, when they were ready to conquer the land that God had promised to them, that there were 2.5 tribes who actually wanted to settle on the east side of the Jordan River rather than cross the Jordan and settle on the west side of the Jordan River. This was Gad, Reuben, and half of Manasseh. So a lot of times this is seen as compromise, like they sort of settled for less than God had for them. And the fact that they were allowed to do this, they had to agree to send their soldiers on across to help conquer the land on the western side of the Jordan. But afterwards, they were allowed to return and be with their families settled there on the eastern side. But their spot there actually was vulnerable. The fact that they compromised meant that later, when they were all taken into captivity, that they would be the first taken into captivity. But keep in mind that in life, as in this particular situation, compromise often leads to complacency. If you and I are compromising in our lives, if we're settling for less than God has for us, if we're refusing to go on in the direction that God has called us to go, oftentimes it just leads to complacency in our life. And so to turn that around, if you're at a place in your life where you become complacent about being a part of what God is doing in this world, or about His plan for you and for your life, you can look to see if there's not some compromise that is sort of underneath that complacency. But picking it up in verse 10, it says, now Zebah and Zalmunna were at Karkor, and their armies with them, about 15,000. That's how we know that about 15,000 had made it across the river from the west to the east bank. All who were left of all the army of the people of the east, for 120,000 men who drew the sword had fallen. Then Gideon went up by the road of those who dwell in tents on the east of Nobah and Jogbehah, and he attacked the army while the camp felt secure. When Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued them, and he took the 2 kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and routed the whole army. So, there had been already 120,000 battle deaths. Only 1 man in 9 had survived. Imagine a large group of people and then numbering off, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 dead. 1 survives, and so on. These were staggering numbers, but the survivors were following this ancient caravan route through Karkor. And what Gideon did that was so brilliant was that he attacked them from the east. When he caught up to them, he went around them to attack them from the east rather than the west, surprising them again. And as a result, he was able to capture their kings. So verse 13, then Gideon, the son of Joash, returned from battle from the ascent of Heres, and he caught a young man of the men of Succoth. So we're back to Succoth, who refused to help, and interrogated him. And he wrote down for him, the young man wrote down for Gideon, the leaders of Succoth and its elders, 77 men. So now Gideon's got a hit list. Then he came to the men of Succoth and said, here are Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you ridiculed me, saying, quote, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hand, that we should give bread to your weary men, end quote. And he took the elders of the city, and thorns of the wilderness, and briars, and with them he taught the men of Succoth. Then he tore down the tower of Penuel, and killed the men of the city. So this was some interrogation in verse 14. Gideon goes all Batman, where are they? And in Succoth, well, the elders were schooled, but in Penuel, they were killed. Now, from Gideon's point of view, this may have been justified since he saw them as collaborators. But as we read the story, we can't help but sense that there was some vindictiveness in it. I'm reminded of what it says in James 1 verse 20 in the New Testament, "For the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God." Now, it's possible in Gideon's case that exhaustion was a factor. It tells us twice in verses 4 and 5 that both Gideon and his men were exhausted. And certainly one thing that we could take from this is the importance of self-care. You know, it is important that we get the rest that we need. It is important that we, eat right and so forth. But it's sad that in this particular case, we see Gideon, who had gone from pre-heroic to heroic, we now see him just a little less heroic. And so picking it up in verse 18, he said to Zebah and Zalmunna, these kings, "What kind of men were they whom you killed at Tabor?" So they answered, "As you are, so were they. Each one resembled the son of a king." Then he said, "They were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if you had let them live, I would not kill you." And he said to Jether, his firstborn, "Rise, kill them." But the youth would not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a youth. So Zebah and Zalmunna said, "Rise yourself and kill us, for as a man is, so is his strength." So Gideon arose and killed Zebah and Zalmunna, and took the crescent ornaments that were on their camels' necks. So, Gideon asks about this battle at Tabor. This is an unknown battle. We have no record of this battle. No doubt it was one of these previous invasions. We learned in the first of these 3 weeks about Gideon how this happened every year, that they would come into the land, destroy the food supply. So it must have been one of these previous years. But in the Bible, there's a thing called the avenger of blood. If a member of your family had been murdered, then you were the avenger of blood, and you could go and you could kill that person. You could go and you could, exact justice in this situation. So again, the avenger of blood. Did someone say the Avengers? Nick Fury? Where? Well, no, it's not exactly that, but it has this idea of vengeance in it. So, in ancient times, particularly on the battlefield, the cause of death mattered. It was important to people how they died, whether they were remembered as dying with or without their dignity. So why would Gideon ask his son to kill these two kings? Couple possibilities. One is to humiliate the two kings so that they would die without their dignity at the hands of a child, of a young person. It's also possible that he thought by giving his young son this opportunity that it would not only humiliate these kings in their death, but that it would honor his son. No doubt it's something that would have been remembered throughout his son's life. It would be known that he had been the one to kill these kings. But in verse 20, we see that he couldn't do it. And, as I think about this text, as a dad, as the father of two daughters, I can't help but think about, was Gideon a good parent or was he a bad parent? In this particular case, it's hard not to think that he was a bad parent, because it just seems to me like Gideon had gone from God's mission to Gideon's mission, So when Zebah and Zalmunna basically tell Gideon to man up, to be a man and to do it himself, he does, but still, he seems even a little less heroic than he did before. And so picking it up in verse 22, it says, "Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, 'Rule over us, both you and your son, and your grandson also, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian.' But Gideon said to them, 'I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you.'" They wanted to be kingmakers. And they wanted not just Gideon, but his son and even his grandson. In other words, they wanted to establish a dynasty. And notice how they said in verse 22 to Gideon, "You have delivered us." Whoa. Gideon was certainly heroic in his role in defeating the Midianites and this coalition of sand people, but you have delivered us? Remember that, back when he had a much larger force, before he'd sent so many of them home, back in chapter 7, verse 2, when the odds were already 4-1 against him. God had said that even at 4-1, if he were to win, he would take credit for it. And so we see that God was absolutely right about that, because even once down to 300 men, once the victory had been won, the people wanted to take credit for it. The people wanted to give credit to Gideon rather than to God. And it's really striking. Like when you think back to the judge Deborah, after the great victory that she and Barak won together in chapter 4. In chapter 5, we have the Song of Deborah, in which she worships God. So as opposed to the worship that followed that victory, here we kind of have this hero worship. Instead of God worship, we have hero worship. And, we're reminded in verse 23 that the only king is God. But look at verse 24. It says, then Gideon said to them, I would like to make a request of you, that each of you would give me the earrings from his plunder, for they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. So they answered, we will gladly give them. And they spread out a garment, and each man threw into it the earrings from his plunder. Now the weight of the gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments, pendants, and purple robes, which were on the kings of Midian, and besides the chains that were around their camels' necks. So Gideon said no to being king, but he said yes to the bling. Now, these earrings in verse 24, we're talking about tens of thousands of earrings. In fact, we are given the weight, taken together, it was 1,700 shekels of gold. So, I'm not entirely sure if I did the math right, but it seems to me that is about 43 pounds, and based on the current value of gold, this is worth about $1.3 million. I Googled the value of gold this week to try to get a current number. So well over $1 million worth of gold was received here by Gideon. And so in verse 27, it says, then Gideon made it into an ephod. That's what he did with the gold. He made it into an ephod, and he set it up in his city, Ophrah. And all Israel played the harlot with it there. It became a snare to Gideon and to his house. Thus Midian was subdued before the children of Israel, so that they lifted their heads no more, and the country had quiet for 40 years in the days of Gideon. Now, this ephod mentioned in verse 27, what was an ephod? Well, an ephod was something worn by the high priest over the chest. It was suspended by shoulder straps and secured by a waistband. And among other things, the ephod held what were known as the Urim and the Thummim. Scholars, aren't really sure what the Urim and the Thummim were exactly, but they were used, whatever they were used for guidance. You may remember that this is a problem area for Gideon going back to his fleece. Remember that, rather than seeking guidance from God, just through prayer, he was asking God to perform signs. And when God, met him where he was, when God, condescended to give Gideon what he needed, the first sign wasn't enough. He asked for a second sign. He threw out a second fleece. And in that message, I talked about that we have to be cautious about becoming sign junkies. I said that it can stunt our spiritual growth, and it can even limit our capacity for living and leading heroically. And so we kind of see that here with Gideon, that he's never able to move into a more mature relationship with God in terms of seeking and receiving guidance. But, he needs the Urim and the Thummim to sort all of that out. But, maybe more importantly, he's playing priest. Like he said no to being king, but here he's playing priest. He's not supposed to be the priest either. So in verse 27, it says that all Israel played the harlot with it there. In Exodus 20, verse 5, it tells us that God is a jealous God. And that sounds funny to us because we normally think of jealousy as a bad thing, but God is not jealous of us, he's jealous for us. And when we replace him with anyone else or with anything else, when we give to anything or anyone his rightful place in our lives, we're essentially cheating on him. If you've ever been cheated on, or if you've ever experienced love lost and you know the pain of that, well, picture God experiencing love lost. The more you love someone, the more that person can hurt you. If it's true that everything that's true about God is infinitely true about him, then he not only loves us, but he loves us infinitely. And if his love for us is an infinite love, then he's capable, obviously, of feeling infinite hurt. So this thing, it became a snare to Gideon and to his house in verse 27. Guys, this has come full circle. Remember at the beginning of the Gideon story, back in chapter 6, before the battlefield came the backyard, where Gideon was asked to destroy this altar, this shrine to a false god that was there on his dad's property. And now he's come full circle. Now he's got this relic, as it were, that people are going to come to, and they're going to worship, and they're going to be involved in false worship. So yet again, we see this man Gideon, who went from pre-heroic to heroic, but then in this part of the story, he's less heroic, and then a little less heroic, and again, now still less heroic. We might even say that at this point, Gideon is post-heroic. And so in verse 29, then Jerubbaal, that's a name that Joash, Gideon's father, gave to him. So this is a reference to Gideon. Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, went and dwelt in his own house. Gideon had 70 sons who were his own offspring, for he had many wives. And his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, whose name he called Abimelech. Now Gideon, the son of Joash, died at a good old age, and he was buried in the tomb of Joash his father in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. So it was, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals and made Baal-berith their god. Thus the children of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them out of the hands of all their enemies on every side, nor did they show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal, Gideon, in accordance with the good he had done for Israel. It's interesting because in the Torah, Moses had warned the people that one day they were going to want a king. And he told them what that king was going to be like, what it was going to be like for them to be ruled by a king. And he warned them about the king's house and the king's wives and the king's concubines. We see all of these things in Gideon, who said no to being king, but who then lived like one. We see the reference to his house in verse 29, to his many wives in verse 30, and to his concubine in verse 31. He's living like a king, even if he refused the title. But check this out. In verse 31, we read about his son named Abimelech. That name Abimelech is a compound name. It actually has two Hebrew nouns. The first is father, and the second is king. He named his son, "My father is the king." Imagine every time he called Abimelech, him saying this name, "My daddy is the king, dinner's ready." I mean, what in the world? Imagine him saying, "Son, what did I name you?" "My daddy's the king." "That's right, son, good boy." I mean, it's so bizarre. It's so bizarre that though he said no to being the king, he lived like one, and then he named his son, "My dad is the king." Gideon has clearly moved well past that place where he's living heroically, and where instead he's in this post-heroic phase. And we see that, with his passing, the people go right back to their old ways. Like it's a short step from Gideon's reintroduction of idolatry to full-blown false worship. Things went right back to the way they were when Gideon was pre-heroic, which surely, at least at a point in time, was not his intention. Chapter 9, which we're not going to look at today or next week, I encourage you to read that on your own, but it serves as almost a postscript to this story. In chapter 9, we have the Abimelech story. "My daddy is the king's" story. He killed his brothers, he tried to make himself the king, and he died a gruesome death. Well, remember, Heroes is the series that asks the question, what's your story? The best thing about this story is that Gideon wasn't always heroic. The worst thing about this story is that Gideon wasn't always heroic. What do I mean the best thing? Well, when we meet Gideon, he's pre-heroic, and I love that because we're pre-heroic too. We could be hopeful, right? This is aspirational, that we can live heroically even if we didn't start out that way.
But what do I mean that this is also the worst thing? Well, at the end, we find Gideon post-heroic. His story didn't end well. In a spiritual sense, it's a rags to riches to rags story. If Gideon teaches us to think less about how our story begins, he teaches us to think more, a lot more, about how it ends. And I hope that we can take that lesson to heart. Let me say a prayer right now. Father, I am so grateful that though we may not yet be heroic, that we're pre-heroic, that you're making heroes of us. But Lord, I want to pray even now that there wouldn't come a time when we're post-heroic, that there wouldn't come a time when we move past that season of living heroically, that we would think a lot about how our story ends. We want it to end well. We want to finish well. Maybe some of us have long since gone from pre-heroic to heroic, but if we were really honest with ourselves, we'd have to say that we're in sort of a post-heroic phase now. It's not too late for us. The story isn't finished. You're still writing our story. And we just invite you into that storyline. We invite you back into the arc of the narrative of our lives, and we just would pray, God, that we could get back to those heroic ways, that we could get back to living heroically in a way that honors you. This is our prayer today. Amen.
And now it's time to fill out a connection card.
Yeah, you should see a link in the chat feed. Of course, you can always go to our website, solachurch.life, and click contact. That's where the connection card lives. That's where you can let us know that you attended online today, but also if you'd like to participate in one of our virtual small groups. They're so fun, right? We love those.
Yeah.
Or if you want to join the launch team, or even if you want to request information about the next startup party.
Exactly. And make sure that you keep checking the website, solachurch.life, and all our social media at Sola Church LA. And with that, we hope you have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everybody.